Right here is the Japan holly tree, and this is why we're here. I'm really excited to share their story with you because this plant right here could replace coffee and tea. This is North America's only caffeinated plant, and it is a local, sustainable, and native source for that caffeine that people love so much.
Every morning, without thinking, without questioning, without even fully waking up first, hundreds of millions of people perform the exact same ritual. The alarm sounds. The feet hit the floor. The hand reaches for the same thing it reached for yesterday. And the day before that. And the year before that. The coffee maker. Not because they chose it. Because they were never shown anything else. There are 7 plants growing on 6 continents right now that produce more caffeine than coffee. 3 of them grow in a bucket on a back porch. 2 of them survive drought, poor soil, and complete neglect. 1 of them has been growing wild in American suburbs for 8,000 years, and most people mow around it every Saturday without ever knowing what it is. 7 plants. 0 pesticides. 0 fertilizer. 0 supply chain. And a $450 billion industry that has spent generations making sure those plants stay nameless. This is not about coffee being bad. This is about something much more uncomfortable than that. It is about the difference between a molecule and a market. Caffeine is a molecule. It occurs naturally in over 60 plant species across every inhabited continent on Earth. Coffee is a market. 1 product, 1 delivery system, 1 industry built around a single plant while 60 others were buried, renamed, forgotten, or quietly erased. The plants that were buried did not disappear. They are still growing. 1 of them was given a fake scientific name by a British royal gardener in 1789, a name designed to make people afraid to touch it. That name is still working. Researchers tested it 2 centuries later and found it still cuts consumer interest nearly in half today. 1 word. Assigned by 1 man. Still killing demand after 236 years. That is not an accident. That is architecture. Hi viewers, here is a question worth pausing on. Did you grow up in a home where coffee was the only morning option? Or was there something else on the table? Drop it in the comments. Because the answer reveals more about how this industry shaped daily life than most people ever stop to consider. There are 7 plants on this list. Each one has a story. Each story has a name that was hidden, a culture that was ignored, and a caffeine profile that outperforms the product sitting in the kitchen right now. By the end, every single name will be known. The only question is which one gets planted first. Here is something nobody ever says out loud in the coffee aisle. The crash is the product, not a side effect, not an unfortunate limitation of biology. The crash is the reason the industry exists at the scale it does. Walk into any office in any city on any weekday afternoon around 2 o'clock. Watch what happens in that break room. Shoulders heavy, eyes glazed, hands reaching for the pot before the brain has even finished forming the thought. 3rd cup, sometimes 4th. Nobody questioning why the most consumed stimulant on Earth stops working every 90 minutes. They just refill the mug. Here is the science behind that cycle. Coffee beans in their raw state contain compounds called polyphenol. These are natural buffers. They slow the rate at which caffeine enters the bloodstream, spreading the stimulation over a longer window, softening the peak, preventing the steep drop that follows it. Raw beans have them. Then the roasting process begins. Temperatures climb past 400 degrees, and those polyphenol burn away. What remains goes into the cup. Caffeine without its natural buffers. A molecule stripped of everything that was supposed to moderate it. The result hits fast. Too fast. Energy spikes within 30 minutes. Heart rate climbs. Focus sharpens briefly. Then 90 minutes later, sometimes less, it collapses. The bloodstream clears. The adenosine receptors flood back. The fatigue returns harder than before. And the hand reaches for the pot again. That cycle repeats 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day for the average adult. Now consider what the 7 plants on this list do differently. Every single one of them delivers caffeine alongside what researchers call a compound stack. A molecule called theobromine that gently stimulates the heart without agitating the nervous system. a compound called theophylline that relaxes smooth muscle tissue, an amino acid called L-theanine that calms neural activity without producing drowsiness. When these compounds travel alongside caffeine inside the same leaf, they do what roasting destroyed in coffee. They buffer the delivery. They extend the curve. They prevent the drop. No laboratory engineered this. No pharmaceutical company designed it. Evolution did. Over millions of years, across 6 continents, these plants developed the exact molecular architecture that produces sustained, clean, stable energy. Indigenous cultures across the Americas, Asia, and Africa discovered this independently, through centuries of careful observation, long before any Western scientist had a name for a polyphenol. And then the industry arrived. Not with force, not with laws, with something quieter and far more effective. With naming, with funding, with the slow, deliberate withdrawal of attention from every plant that could not generate recurring revenue. 7 plants that buffer their own caffeine naturally. 1 industry that profits from the version that does not. The economy of the crash runs on $450 billion a year. And it started with a single plant that one people called the night watchman. Deep in the Ecuadorian Amazon, before the sun clears the canopy, before the forest fully wakes, a fire is already burning. The Quechua people of the upper Amazon basin have been lighting it at the same hour for at least 2,000 years. They fill gourds with hot liquid brewed from the long green leaves of a tall evergreen growing in the shade beneath the jungle. And then they sit, together, in the dark, and they share what they dreamed. This is not casual morning routine. This is civilization organized around a plant. The tree is guayusa, an evergreen holly native to the river tributaries of Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. Under full conditions it reaches nearly 100 feet and lives for over a century. Its leaves contain caffeine at concentrations between 1.9 and 7.6% of dry weight. Arabica coffee beans sit at roughly 1.4%. At its peak, a single guayusa leaf holds more than 5 times the caffeine of a coffee bean. No other leaf on earth comes close to that number. But the Quechua did not choose this tree for the caffeine alone. Guayusa leaves carry the full compound stack. L-theanine, theobromine, a dense concentration of polyphenol and flavonoids. The result is an energy curve that builds slowly over 30 minutes and holds steady for 4 to 6 hours. No spike, no collapse, no second gourd needed. Hunters drank it before overnight watches in the rainforest. They sat motionless in total darkness for hours, completely alert, completely calm. Not for minutes, for hours. And then there is the other effect, the one Western science still cannot fully explain. The Quechua developed a practice of drinking several cups before dawn and returning to sleep for roughly an hour afterward. During that hour, they report vivid, directable dreams, a state of consciousness where the sleeper knows they are asleep and can steer the experience. When they wake, the community gathers again. Dreams are interpreted collectively. Hunting routes are chosen based on what appeared. Decisions about the sick, the lost, the uncertain are shaped by what the plant revealed in the dark. One tree sustained energy while awake, sharpened consciousness while asleep. Coffee does not do that. In a container, guayusa stays manageable. Zones 9 through 11 in the United States can keep it outdoors year-round. Anywhere cooler, treat it as a tropical indoor plant and bring it inside once nighttime temperatures fall below 50 degrees. Shade cloth in summer. A south-facing window in winter. One tree, properly kept, produces harvestable leaves for decades. The process is exactly what the Quechua use. Pick the leaves. Dry them in the shade. Steep in hot water. The same method. 2,000 years old. Still working. Now, there is a holly bush growing wild from the sandy plains of coastal Texas to the tidewater marshes of Virginia. It grows in ditches, along fence lines, in the trimmed hedges outside suburban banks and shopping centers. Landscaping crews shape it into neat forms every week across the American Southeast. Millions of people walk past it daily on their way to buy coffee. It is the only plant native to North America that contains caffeine. And someone spent 236 years making sure it stayed invisible. This plant is Yupan holly. Indigenous peoples of the southeastern woodlands brewed it for at least 8,000 years. 3,000 years longer than Chinese tea has existed. The Timucua of what is now Florida considered it sacred. The Cherokee used it. The Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, the Caddo. Tribes across the entire southeast processed its leaves into a dark caffeinated drink that moved along trade networks stretching from the Gulf Coast deep into the interior plains. This was the most widely consumed stimulant in pre-contact North America. Not imported tea. Not coffee. A holly bush, growing wild in sandy soil. European colonists documented it. Some liked it. Some began exporting it back to England. And that is precisely when it became a threat.
The name of this plant is a Yaupon holly. Its scientific name is Ilex vomitoria, and it's the only North American plant species to have caffeine in it. It was drank by the indigenous peoples, and somehow it fell out of favor.
In 1789, a British botanist named William Ayton, working as the royal gardener at Kew Gardens in London, assigned Yaupon holly a new scientific name, Ilex vomitoria, the holly that causes vomiting. It was a fabrication. Centuries of recorded daily consumption showed no such effect. The ceremonial version was sometimes prepared at extreme concentration for ritual purposes. Ayton took that single edge case and branded the entire species with it. Researchers at the University of Florida now believe this was deliberate. The British East India Company controlled the global tea and coffee trade. A free caffeinated plant growing wild across the American colonies was a direct economic threat. One Latin name, assigned by one man, still cutting consumer interest nearly in half when tested 2 centuries later. That is not botany. That is strategy. Yaupon has the highest ratio of theobromine to caffeine of any caffeinated plant ever tested. Almost zero tannins, which means no bitterness, no stomach upset, no teeth staining. A cup steeped for a full hour stays smooth. It grows in poor soil. It tolerates drought and salt air. Deer avoid it. Strip the leaves by hand. Dry them on a screen. Roast lightly for depth of flavor. Steep and drink. Free caffeine. From a plant a royal gardener tried to erase with a word. But Yaupon was not the only one the colonial era could not fully control. In Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and the river-edge cities of southern Brazil, there is a drink that functions less like a beverage and more like a handshake. A single gourd. A metal straw. Hot water poured over dried leaves and passed from hand to hand in parks, on job sites, between university classes, across Sunday family gatherings along the river in Buenos Aires as the sun falls behind the skyline. This is yerba mate. The plant is Ilex paraguayensis, another holly. The indigenous Guarani people cultivated it long before European contact. When Jesuit missionaries arrived in the 17th century, they recognized its commercial potential immediately and built plantations across their mission territories to control production. The plant won. It spread through indigenous trade networks faster than any colonial administration could contain. Yerba mate is the only one of the 7 that survived the colonial era with its cultural identity completely intact. The Jesuits tried. The empire moved on. The gourd kept being passed. A typical cup carries roughly 80 milligrams of caffeine, alongside meaningful concentrations of theobromine and trace amounts of theophylline. The 3 compounds together produce a sustained plateau of alertness. A slow build that holds for hours and fades without a sharp edge. The kind of energy where 3 hours pass and the mind never once felt the familiar warning of a crash approaching. 3 continents. 3 holly trees. All caffeinated. All carrying the compound stack. All invisible in the North American grocery aisle while the coffee section grows longer every single year. And there are still 4 plants left. 1 species. That is the entire global tea industry. Green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong, all of it, every cup ever poured in every tea room on every continent, comes from a single plant. Camellia sinensis. And Americans grow its ornamental relatives in their front yards across the entire South right now without ever making the connection. Camellia sinensis is a camellia, the same genus as the flowering shrubs landscapers plant along driveways and garden borders from Georgia to California. The tea plant belongs there. It grows as a naturally compact shrub, reaches about 6 feet in a large container, tolerates pruning, and produces new leaf growth in multiple rounds across a single growing season. One 18-inch pot with acidic soil and partial shade. That is the entire requirement. Here is what makes this plant unlike any other on the list. The caffeine level is controlled entirely by the grower. Not by the plant. By the decision made after picking. White tea, the least processed form, delivers roughly 35 milligrams per cup. Green tea holds at around 50. Oolong climbs to 75. Black tea, fully oxidized, reaches 90 milligrams. The same leaf, the same plant, for completely different stimulant profiles, determined entirely by how long the leaf is allowed to oxidize after harvest. No other plant on Earth gives that level of control to the person growing it. In 2025, global coffee prices surged more than 70%. Shoppers stood in grocery aisles staring at $12 bags that cost $7 6 months before. Harvests in Brazil and Vietnam buckled under climate pressure. Shipping lanes backed up at ports worldwide. Commodity traders pushed futures prices to levels not seen in 2 decades. And a single tea plant in a terracotta pot on a back porch kept producing, uninterrupted, unbothered, connected to no supply chain that could fail. One patio plant versus an ocean of variables. But there is still a plant on this list that the modern world consumes every single day in a form so corrupted that almost nobody recognizes what they are actually eating. 3,000 years ago, the civilizations of Mesoamerica consumed cacao. Not as a sweet, not as a comfort food, as a functional stimulant drink prepared before long journeys and high-stakes negotiations. The Olmec developed it first. The Maya refined it. The Aztec warriors carried it. Bitter paste ground from dried seeds, mixed with water and chili, consumed in the dark before demanding physical and mental effort. The plant is Theobroma cacao. The name translates to food of the gods. The dominant stimulant in cacao is not caffeine. It is theobromine, a vasodilator that acts on the cardiovascular system rather than the central nervous system. The energy it produces feels fundamentally different from caffeine. Not electricity in the skull. Warmth through the chest. Steady and grounded rather than sharp and brittle. Cacao beans carry 6 to 10 times more theobromine than caffeine, which means the small amount of caffeine present is completely buffered by the ratio around it. The result is an energy experience unlike anything the modern stimulant market sells. Then the modern market arrived. The cacao bean was processed. Heavy roasting stripped the active compounds. Sugar entered in large quantities. Dairy fat followed. The bitter, functional warrior drink of 3,000 years became a candy bar wrapped in foil on a checkout counter. The original purpose was buried so thoroughly that most people alive today have never once considered that chocolate was originally medicine. Raw cacao nibs carry the original compound profile. Ceremonial-grade cacao paste, sourced correctly, delivers the full effect the Aztec warriors knew. Growing a cacao tree indoors requires warmth, humidity, and patience. The pods take time, but when they finally ripen and split, the raw material inside connects directly to a 3,000-year lineage that the confectionery industry spent a century trying to disguise as dessert. 2 plants down in this chapter. 2 stories of suppression. But the final 2 plants are the ones the industry fears most. Because one of them is hiding inside every major energy drink ever sold. And nobody put its name on the label. West Africa, centuries before the first coffee shipment crossed the Atlantic. In communities across what is now Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, the kola nut was not a snack. It was ceremony, offered at births, presented at marriages, shared at funerals, passed between leaders before negotiations to signal honesty and mutual respect. The nut itself is bitter, astringent, and deeply functional. Chewed slowly, it releases caffeine at concentrations between 2 and 3.5% of dry weight. Higher than coffee. Paired naturally with theobromine in a ratio that produces clean, extended alertness without the familiar sharp edge of a crash. The Hausa people chewed it on long journeys. Traders carried it across the Sahara. It was the stimulant of endurance, not of speed. Then a pharmacist in Atlanta in 1886 named his new beverage after it. Coca-Cola. The cola nut sat at the center of the original formula. The product carried its name to global recognition. And then quietly, at some point in the 20th century, the cola nut extract was removed from the recipe entirely. The name stayed. The plant disappeared. One of the most historically significant caffeinated plants on Earth is now most famous for lending its name to a product that no longer contains it. It still grows. Tropical climate. Manageable in a large container with warmth and humidity. Still producing those bitter, caffeinated seeds. Still carrying the same compound profile it carried across the Sahara centuries ago. Still nameless in the West. And then there is the seventh plant. It grows as a climbing vine in the Amazon basin. Its seeds are small, dark, and dense. When researchers first measured the caffeine concentration in those seeds, some checked their instruments twice. The seeds of Polinia cubana, known as guarana, contain between 4 and 8% caffeine by dry weight. That is 3 to 4 times the concentration found in coffee beans. The indigenous Satirma people of the Amazon have ground those seeds into paste for centuries, using it to sustain energy across multi-day hunting expeditions deep in the forest. Not cups, not mugs. A paste carried in the hands, consumed in small amounts, delivering hours of clean, focused alertness at a time when stopping to rest could mean going without food. Here is the part the energy drink industry counts on nobody knowing. Guarana extract is the primary caffeine source in a significant number of the most popular energy drinks currently sold worldwide. It is listed on the label, often in the fine print, under the ingredient panel. And then the front of the can says caffeine content in large numbers as though the molecule appeared from nowhere, with no plant, no name, no origin. The Satirma people domesticated this plant. They cultivated it. They developed the processing knowledge that makes it usable. And a multi-billion-dollar energy drink industry built its stimulant infrastructure on their work and listed the plant name in a font barely large enough to read. Guarana grows on a trellis in a large container. It needs warmth. It needs patience. When the seeds ripen and are harvested and ground, the product in hand connects directly to centuries of Amazonian knowledge that the modern market monetized without ever speaking the plant's name to the people buying the can. 7 plants. 6 continents. Thousands of years of human knowledge built around each one. Now consider the arithmetic. Plant Yupan holly once. Produces caffeinated leaves for decades. No replanting. No fertilizer. No pesticides. No importation. No roasting facility. No subscription renewal. No price surge when a drought hits Brazil. One planting becomes a permanent source. A permanent source generates zero recurring revenue. Zero recurring revenue attracts zero corporate investment. Zero investment means zero marketing. Zero marketing means zero shelf space. And zero shelf space means the cycle continues generation after generation with consumers who never learn the names. This is not a hidden agenda. It is economics. The 2025 price surge was not a surprise to anyone paying attention. Climate instability in 2 countries disrupted the supply of a product that half the developed world depends on daily. Prices climbed. Options narrowed. People paid more. And 7 plants that could have filled that gap sat in ditches, in suburban hedges, in the undercanopy of the Amazon, unnamed and unharvested. The Quechua gathered around their fire before sunrise and shared their dreams. The Guarani passed the mate gourd through the park on a Sunday afternoon. The Satirma ground seeds by hand before walking into the forest for days. Caffeine was always communal before it became commercial. It was always knowledge before it became a product. The industry spent over 2 centuries making sure those names stayed buried. Every single one of them surfaced here. And what comes next goes even deeper. Because there is a plant not on this list that was used by one of the most powerful trading empires in history, suppressed by a government that controlled its borders, and then quietly reintroduced into the global market under a different name so that almost nobody recognized it. That story is in the next video. And once it is heard, the coffee aisle will never look the same again.